The quickest glance at almost any anthology of British or American literature would reveal that nature has been a thematic staple in the diet of English-speaking bibliophiles for hundreds of years, even before the likes of Wordsworth and Coleridge treated every bush like it was the burning bush. The natural world provided an indispensable reference point for contemplating, framing, and defining humankind's place within this terrifyingly beautiful world. Literary notions of the sublime and the serene thrived on both sides of the Atlantic, with the latter constituting the thematic lifeblood of the seminal essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. But, as I'm sure anyone who's attempted to breach the adamantium-coated skulls of students under the age of 25 with canonical literature's worth and merit can attest, it's hard to recommend nature poetry, or nature writing in general, as an effective bludgeoning instrument, as the gateway drug with which to launch a lifelong addiction to the written word. Given the general intellectual lethargy with which students drag their eyes across lines of romantic poetry, The Birds and the Bees turns out to be a pretty effective euphemism for deflecting attention away from the really interesting stuff. Perhaps this is because we live in an era in which nature is less something to regard with a pleasurable mix of fear and awe, and more something to protect, preserve, and make overlong documentaries about. In other words, the romantic view of nature has been largely supplanted by the discourse of environmentalism, turning us from worshipful admirers of nature's unsearchable grandeur into its defenders and stewards. To give just one example of media, think about the comparatively few number of songs that seek to capture the essences of flowers, wind, and rain. In this day and age, that seems more the domain of household cleaning products than any serious work of art. In fact, songs that start off by conceiving of nature in these antiquated quasi-mystical terms often end up changing their thematic footing mid-song.
If I could capture the soft morning dew or rally the flowers and trees, I'd have lots of wood for my picket signs, and just maybe then you'd love me.
Perhaps we just haven't found a way of articulating the sublime and the beautiful in a way that widely resonates with present-day audiences, or maybe this particular paradise should just stay forever paved. In any case, that Stairway to Heaven, a text considered by many to be the most famous rock song of all time, unironically boasts such quaint turns of phrase as, "In a tree by the brook, there's a songbird who sings," is just odd. As far as established interpretations go, the song is saying something about the natural world. On that much fans can agree. Exactly what it's saying and why it matters, however, is a subject of much debate. A debate whose fires are only stoked by the fact that even Robert Plant counts himself among those who have trouble pinning down just what the speaker of Stairway is on about. Luckily, to avail myself of a cliche that I'm sure nature lovers just adore, there is more than one way to skin this cat. As I've pointed out before, a popular though often misguided and reductive starting point for unraveling the mysteries of cryptic works like Stairway is, of course, to consult the author. But with Plant seemingly as bewildered as the rest of us, the author said-so path won't bear us any fruit in this case. The common sense view would have us believe that authors and artists need only whisper into the cosmic tide and wait while their masterpiece beaches itself like a mighty leviathan upon our cultural shores. But scholars who work within both new historicism and cultural criticism take a different, and I think more sophisticated tack to understanding cultural productions like art, music, and literature. The author or artist can wax as rhapsodic as he wants about that red, red rose, but there's always the possibility that the allergy-ridden colorblind peasants from the nearby fishing village will chase his painstakingly composed Leviathan back into the sea. To the cultural critic, the artist or author is not to be conceived as a dazzling sorcerer who summons his work out of some arcane dimension, but a kind of morbidly obese aquaphile floating in a mid-sized swimming pool with other morbidly obese aquaphiles, each contributing to the bouncy back and forth momentum of the other. Think about all the literary and non-literary texts from a given point in history. songs, art, photos, news, speeches, essays, books, advertisements, anything that can be experienced with the senses and understood, as being tangled within the same web. No text can so much as twitch without the others feeling it. The cultural critic focuses on the interplay of texts within the larger web of human discourse, a web that has always existed and that digital technology has simply made more accessible. Considering how individual texts shape and are shaped by other circulating discourses in the broader historical and socio-political context. This is a massive undertaking and one made all the more dizzying in this age of information, with an exhaustive inventory of voices both big and small, both documentary and literary, impossible to attain. And so the cultural critic recognizes the tentative nature of her contributions that, much like the text being interpreted, represent only a moment in an ongoing dialogue between interpreters. Despite what my metaphors might have suggested, cultural criticism is not about denying the role of the author's personal identity or doing away with such notions as talent or genius, which I think would be pretty depressing, but about examining the role that cultural institutions inevitably play in shaping the output of the creative identity, an attempt to describe the ways in which talent and genius is acted upon and directed by larger social, cultural, and political forces, which it, in turn, acts upon and directs. Textual interpretation, so understood, is made richer when we consider how a given artist's thread is woven into a larger cultural tapestry. Even lyrical commentary asserting that all our favorite rock songs can be decoded with a three-word cipher, "It's about drugs," are engaged in a type, albeit the laziest type, of cultural criticism. Such readers look at the culture of drug use and abuse prevalent in the lifestyles of so many touring musicians, place a particular song against that cultural backdrop, and let their interpretations arise like so many stale farts. These readings often fail not because culture does not matter, but because the textual support is often flimsy or absent altogether, and because capitalized assertions punctuated by periods are no substitute for solid reasoning. So rest assured that whatever discursive tapestry or cultural conversation we embed Stairway within, we are ever the slaves to what the text actually says. If we are committed to making textual interpretation the productive brain-shredding exercise it can be, rather than the poo-throwing extravaganza it often turns into, we should never go where the text itself does not lead us, even if this particular stairway seems to be leading us in an infinite number of directions. And as unintuitive as it sounds, a text like Stairway, whose ambiguity permits a potentially limitless number of interpretations, still doesn't permit us to read into the song whatever our current mood dictates. With the late 60s and early 70s being one of those periods where you'd be hard-pressed to find anything that wasn't being discussed and debated, probed and protested, there's certainly no shortage of discursive interplay. And as I've mulled over the lyrics to Stairway, I find that situating the song within the then burgeoning discourse of environmentalism not only adds an interesting and, as far as I can tell, mostly unexplored interpretive layer to a text that's been interpreted nearly to death, but also helps us make literal sense out of a text that resists even that. So let's start with a bird's eye view of the environmental discourse circulating in the United States in the years leading up to the song's release. There's a lot here, so pause the video if you want to fact check me or would like the search terms needed to research any of this information more deeply. These examples center on scientific and legal discourse, but the shift can be heard in the soundscape as well. Many of the environmental concerns of the 60s and early 70s are conveniently condensed into Marvin Gaye's Mercy Mercy Me, a song released the same year as Stairway, and one that serves as a nice thumbnail sketch of the US's raised environmental consciousness. Pause and give these lyrics a read. You'll see what I mean. And yes, the US seems to be the primary locus of the modern environmental movement, but as Mark Wilson notes, environmental consciousness, not unlike that in the US, was also taking root in Zeppelin's native Britain. Not surprising, given the global implications of the subject matter. I'm not here to argue that Plant consciously intended to contribute anything to the cultural conversation in the way of, say, Carson's Silent Spring or Ehrlich's The Population Bomb. I can't find any evidence to suggest that Plant had anything on the brain other than Lewis Spence's The Magic Arts in Celtic Britain. But given that the circulation of environmental discourse was well underway at the time of the song's conception and release, it's hard not to wonder whether a song so clearly about nature has anything to say about what was quickly becoming the paradigm for relating humankind to the world around us. And given that the discourse of environmentalism has only evolved in the intervening 45 years, it's worthwhile to try and figure out whether a rock song as annoyingly famous as Stairway, a fame due in no small part to its lyrics, whether in standard forward mode or backward Satan mode, has anything relevant to say about the pressing issues of its day. And so I will argue that by allowing the environmental lens suggested by the culture in which the text emerged to supplement the quasi-mystical lens that the text itself invites, we end up with a surprisingly coherent, yet still charmingly eccentric message that marries the wide-eyed romanticism of early 19th century English literature with an environmental discourse still relevant today. This green reading, as I will call it, starts to suggest itself a couple of verses in.
In keeping with my usual approach, I interspersed my own acoustic cover of Stairway to Heaven in the original version of this video. However, due to a claim by the copyright holder, the audio was muted, as was the audio of countless other Stairway covers featured on YouTube. I've chosen to edit the song portions out of the video because, quite frankly, the copyright holder has every legal right to decide how people propagate their material. I choose to cover songs myself because I value covers as the purest form of immersion and a powerful way to honor the song as a subjective work of art. This is especially important to me here, considering that most of my analysis videos are inescapably about working toward an objective understanding of that art. And I never want to give the impression that I believe songs merely to be intellectual fodder. Including the song within the video is also my preferred method for keeping it fresh in our minds as we delve deeply into what the song's lyrics have to offer. And so I recommend that if you are only casually acquainted with Stairway, you familiarize yourself with the lyrics using one of the numerous available outlets before jumping into this video. I regret that I cannot release the video as originally intended, but am grateful for an opportunity to clarify why I do what I do in my other analyses. On the bright side, at least we have before us a substantially shorter video.
The initial verses kickstart the song as a champion of the non sequitur, as it seems at first that we have a text with a decidedly Marxist bent on our hands. With a clarity, focus, and richness of language unmatched anywhere in the rest of the text, the speaker tells of a lady so unfettered by financial reality that the very stairway to heaven is reduced to something you might expect to be conveyed into your mansion on the backs of a couple of grunting delivery boys. And whether he knew it or not, Plant's speaker is alluding here to Jacob's ladder from the book of Genesis, and while we can go into all sorts of detail about its cultural significance, we'll try to maintain our momentum and conceive of the stairway more generally as the connection between heaven and earth, God and man, between this earthly life with its frustrating complexity and ambiguity, and a higher, simpler, attainable, sustainable truth. It's all a really clever way of saying that this person views the whole of reality through kitsch shop dollar sign glasses. Hers is the everything's for sale mentality carried to absurdity. But the text takes it one step further. The stairway to heaven, as it turns out, is not the purchase to end all purchases, but an escalator ridden to the second floor of a celestial shopping center. The lady believes that her money not only buys her access to truth, but mastery over it, since heaven too must surely have a thriving economy. Those pearly gates, golden roads, and crystal seas don't pay for themselves after all. As reflected here, capital is not the means to gratify some other psychological end. It is the means and the end. Put in Marxist terms, the material world out there plays a constitutive role in constructing reality as we experience it in here. In this case, so castrating the lady's imagination that even her own private heaven can escape the iron grip of capitalism, adding a disturbing psychological dimension to
Paradise, put up a parking lot.
She's buying rather than she bought is telling, as the transaction is never actually completed. Our Lady spins and spins, only to spin and spin. We can see the ADD meds starting to wear off in this next bit, as the speaker redirects his attention from consumerism to language itself. Still picturing ourselves in a shopping mall, we see Our Lady relishing the joys of textual interpretation. Because apparently there is more than one way to interpret a sign reading Ming Dynasty vase containing ancestors' souls not for sale. The speaker shifts thematic gears again with the Pulitzer Prize-worthy "In a Tree by the Brook, There's a Songbird Who Sings." And evidently the natural alternative to Ritalin was the way to go, because the speaker more or less stays nature-oriented from here on in. Grateful for the reminder that songbirds do in fact sing, this is where the song's thematic foliage starts to peek through the concrete of Our Lady's heavenly metropolis. And I was giving the text a bit of a hard time with the ADD jokes, because Our Thoughts Are Misgiven connects right back to words have two meanings, and the whole sequence is made more coherent when we consider how they complete the bit about the songbird. The dissonance of symbol-dependent navigation and negotiation is made clearer when laid against the harmony of the bird, tree, brook, and our friend the befuddled beaver. The bird's song unites it with the totality of the cosmos, but can we be said to achieve that same kind of wholeness with our oftentimes ambiguous words? As the speaker would have it, the very capacity that elevates us above the rest of nature also separates us from it. We seem to have strayed quite far from our green reading, but the text is actually setting up, in a rather Byzantine fashion, the song's competing ideologies. That text can act as a sort of ideological battleground is an idea that has served us well in past readings, and I think it will be just as useful here. Furthermore, if we supplement with an environmental lens the quasi-spiritual lens with which we are apt to read the speaker's references to trees, brooks, birds, and much of what follows, we can more easily see the lady and the songbird in ideological tension, and locating that central tension, sometimes tacit, other times explicit, is always helpful when establishing our interpretational footing in almost any text. Through lenses informed only by romanticism, the speaker's mostly stream of consciousness style is likely to leave us feeling like we've strapped a saddle onto a horse-shaped squirrel, which is probably how we're going to feel with any reading of this song. But much added discombobulation comes from the fact that consumerism and nature worship aren't necessarily opposed to one another. After all, nothing gets the blood flowing for a Black Friday shopathon like a 2-hour yoga session by the jolly old werewood tree. But through the more pragmatic and political perspective of the environmentalist, consumerism and environmentalism are natural enemies. What is the consumer consuming, if not, at least indirectly, the Earth's natural resources? But one caught up in the rapturous excesses of consumerism is unlikely to mourn the number of leveled forests required to provide the ultra-strength toilet tissue designed to accommodate the mountainous bowel movements of her pet elephant. A sort of brazen disregard for the ecological toll, the inability or unwillingness to acknowledge the difference between the price and the cost, is the dividing line between the consumer and the consumerist. Simply by framing the tree, brook, and bird as things not only consecrated by the speaker, but also consumed by the lady and her like, our green reading has helped us to articulate a tension that will stabilize the text going forward. With all this prompting the speaker to wonder, there's no guessing what tree our noble steed will lead us up next. It's even easier to chalk the speaker's crying spirit up to wanderlust than it is to spot an oblique Lord of the Rings allusion in rings of smoke through the trees. I mean, who is on the other side of those trees? Gandalf the Grey? Given that Zeppelin frequently taps the fantasy aesthetic, I don't think that picturing the speaker as a kind of Frodo or Bilbo, fixing his eyes on the western frontiers beyond the humdrum shelter of the Shire, with a Gandalf as guide, is straying too far from the literal here. And it's also worth considering how, through a green lens especially, rings of smoke through the trees could be read as, if not pollution, then at the very least, human encroachment on the pristine wilderness. The voices of those who stand looking presents us with a bit of work, and not just because the grammar suggests that the speaker sees the voices in the same way that he sees the smoke, and the line has a totally different tone depending on which side of the trees we imagine the lookers. This could be read as those who stand looking, or
Those who stand looking.
but the green reading will soon allow us to tie a biodegradable bow around this and other ambiguities. What kind of tune are we to call, for example? Why is the piper who, according to medieval legend, mesmerized a village of children into following him into the unknown, going to lead us to reason? The Romantics, from whom this text draws obvious influence, were reacting against an age of reason, attempting to usher in a literary tradition that celebrated subjectivity, intuition, spirit, imagination, all that is gloriously irrational, in other words. The nature worshipper doesn't want to be led to reason, she wants to be led to ecstasy, to transcendence. Whatever the nature of its spell, the tune must have some serious magical potency, with a new day dawning for those who stand long, and the forests echoing with what I assume to be elven laughter. Confusing, right? Well, yeah, but only if we come at the text with the standard close reading toolkit, which is not the goal here. Placing the text within an environmental schema significantly reduces our interpretational options and helps all those peculiar and ambiguous little details click right into place. Let's start with this piper's tune business. And it's whispered that soon, if we all call the tune, then the piper will lead us to reason, moans sensuously beneath the sweet caresses of our green reading. We can rattle off answers to any of the questions that the close reader should be asking here. Who's whispering? Those hopeful that we will soon stop treating the earth like it has regenerative Wolverine powers, of course. And to address the questions I posed earlier, if we all call the tune might be translated for our modern ears as if we, the whole of humanity, can stop denying and start decrying climate change, then the piper will lead us to reason. That is, we could finally see the toll that treating our ecological inheritance with all the frugality of a sociopathic trust fund kid is taking on dear sweet Mother Earth. If by some miracle we can accomplish this, then the forests will echo with the laughter of future generations, rather than, say, echo with the collective smoker's cough of a population ground beneath the boot heel of some world-eating smog cloud. That we are led to reason instead of ecstasy, then, is understandable, since environmentalism has always presented itself as a movement by and for scientists and pragmatists. I would argue that those who stand looking and those who stand long are one and the same, as both phrases are descriptive of the meditative loitering of those prone to see heaven in a wildflower, if I may borrow the words of the great William Blake. And it's not hard to see why the aforementioned world-eating smog cloud would put quite the damper on your Walden-esque retreat into the wilderness. While it's just plain stupid to suggest that it's the only way to make sense of these lines, I'm honestly surprised at how the environmental angle allows us to mop up those odd little details we might otherwise attribute to bad writing. Let's see how the rest of the text looks beneath a green lens. With it now firmly established that the text can be read environmentally, the rest of the song falls into place once we're past the whole bustle in your hedgerow bit, with the shift into second person suggesting that the speaker is now talking to the lady from verse 1. We have the May Queen, another medieval legend thought to embody nature in all her glorious abundance, sloughing off a stifling article of clothing and tossing it into the nearest hedgerow. Nature rejects man's vain attempts, represented in both the bustle and the hedgerow, to beautify that which is already beautiful. That this is a spring clean ties back to the speaker's earlier hope that a new day will dawn, as both spring and dawn are tied to the idea of starting anew. And like before, he implies that not everyone will, or even wants to, bask in the glow of this bright new age, whether viewed through a romantic or environmental environmental lens, the meaning here doesn't change, only the emphasis. The idea of Mother Nature shedding man's trappings through a romantic lens is a celebration of nature's triumph over human imposition and artificiality. Through the green lens, it's a vision of nature no longer squeezed into the corset of human exploitation. No matter how you choose to fill in the blanks, there's a bit of nonsense that crops up here unless we are careful in our understanding of the syntax. The listener cannot still have time to change the road she's on in the long run, as one cannot operate within both the urgent present and the distant future. We can make sense of this by imagining an ellipsis here, those three often passive-aggressive dots inviting the lady to wonder right along with the speaker what kind of global garbage heap the lady will bequeath to her great-grandkids before assuring her that there's still time to change the road she's on. And unless we are to understand that a vengeful wood elf lurks insidiously in the nearby hedgerow, the kind of urgency invoked here has the same sort of timbre as any prophecy of ecological apocalypse. If we maintain that the Piper's Call acts as a sort of metaphor for environmentalism's rise as a social, legal, and political force to be reckoned with, and one that clearly wasn't going to subside anytime soon, then the lady's humming head could be a way of describing the environmental dissident's slow acceptance of reality. In a rhetorical gesture that recalls 1 Kings chapter 19, the speaker insists that your stairway lies on the whispering wind, signifying the subtlety and intangibility of truth that can be neither bought nor sold. One of the song's best lines is also one of its most unapologetically romantic. Or maybe the speaker's just a proponent of wind power. Scratch that. Once Zeppelin starts sounding like Zeppelin again, the clouds of obscurity part just long enough to see our solar-powered green reading through to the song's conclusion. There are a number of ways we might interpret our shadows taller than our soul, but what we're interested in here is a picture of our darker, more shadowy aspirations exceeding the best and most wholesome parts of ourselves. And as much as the text gives us reason to imagine the lady we all know as some supple plant-woman hybrid frustratingly untouchable in her erotic appeal, the surrounding language points to this as being another representation of the same lady. She shines white light is indicative of the kind of person who lives by the mantra, if it ain't diamond encrusted, it ain't worth having, and wants to show how everything still turns to gold, is characteristic of one incapable of conceiving of a value that isn't immediately preceded by a dollar sign. When gold is the basic building block of truth, what can one do but reduce the whole of nature to a piggy bank waiting to be smashed? The song's final sentiments are no less romantic than its well-established fondness for nature and magical beings. We have truth arrived at by way of meditative intuition and a sort of neo-pantheistic view of the cosmos. There's no reason why the tune can't continue to serve as a metaphor for rising environmental awareness, but the grammar that follows is challenging, with two sentence fragments expressing two incomplete thoughts. When all are one and one is all, what? To be a rock and not to roll is? Bewildering grammar notwithstanding, it's easy enough to read this as more environmental rhetoric. Is not all are one and one is all one way of describing the fragile interconnectedness of Earth's ecosystems, in which endangering the part imperils the whole? We are left with what is perhaps a call for humility and stillness, despite our propensity for bulldozing whatever helpless mammal stands between us and our profit margin. With one last return to the Stairway refrain, it seems the speaker's rhetoric has ultimately failed, as Our Lady is still locked in an eternally incomplete transaction, forever trying to purchase the unpurchasable. And yet it is as rhetoric as a strategic attempt to disabuse the lady, and by extension us, of our materialistic ways, that we can begin to see how the speaker's voice might exist in harmony with a larger cultural chorus. No matter what we take away from his message, the speaker is an apologist of objective truth in a world where truth is just another transaction. The issue at hand is clear, but the text is infuriatingly enigmatic and produces producing solutions to its own problems. Master, I've renounced my worldly possessions and am prepared to receive your truth. Your stairway lies on the whispering wind. Hold on, I don't think I heard you right. If you listen very hard, the tune will come to you at last. Tune? When all are one and one is all, to be a rock and not to roll. Here is a speaker fully content to grope the ether with the tendrils of his intuition. And since the passage to truth runs through the heart rather than the mind, it's no surprise that he invites his listener to do the same. But it's also no surprise when her mental tentacles, and ours, aren't quite as proficient at ethereal groping. Romanticism's rosy cheeks will blush winsomely no matter how we look at it. But reading the text as participating in environmental discourse still circulating to this day grounds this otherwise even more confusing text in the easy-to-understand conflict between economy and ecology. In the interest of transparency, this is not an argument that the song should be lauded as some kind of literary masterpiece, though a musical masterpiece it certainly is. There are glimpses of brilliance here, but personally, the lyrics seem, and by all accounts were, too hastily thrown together to reach the stylistic heights of Wordsworth, Coleridge, Blake, Byron, Keats, or Shelley. And it's too ambiguously environmental to be more widely recognized as participating in that discourse. What makes this song quite unlike anything I've seen, however, is how we can observe all of these intertextual streams emptying into the conflux that is Stairway to Heaven. All of these textual and thematic spermatozoa converging on this single eligible ovum. The song's quirky, often ambiguous, and sometimes seemingly erroneous language results in an interpretational spectrum so broad that no single reading can offer anything in the way of a comprehensive understanding of all the ways in which the song means. No matter the color of the lens, the song is ultimately a testament to how both writers and readers, whether we like it or not, must operate within the wider web of discourse from which a given text emerged and in which it is being interpreted. Text can never be anything more or less than a response to the texts that precede and surround them, yet with texts as ambiguous as Stairway, therein lies the paradox. No matter how thoroughly we attend to the surrounding historical and socio-cultural context, and no matter how rigorously and consistently we anchor our observations in the text's exact words, listeners will likely continue to coax meaning from this song for the next 45 years. That is all I have to say, but certainly not all that can be said. What have I oversimplified, overcomplicated, or left out altogether? What other discourses circulating in the 60s and 70s can help us make better sense of Stairway to Heaven? What other songs take on interesting or unorthodox shades of meaning when we take the surrounding culture into account? Let me know all I've missed in the comments below, and please be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth song analysis. This is Professor Chase. Hope to see you next lesson.
Whoa, mercy, mercy me. Ah, things ain't what they used to be. No, no. Where did all the blue skies go? Poison is the wind that blows from the north and south and east. Oh, mercy, mercy me, Father. Oh, things ain't what they used to be. No, no. Oh, you're wasted on the ocean and upon our seas, fish full of mercury. Yeah. Oh, mercy, mercy me. Oh, things ain't what they used to be. No, no. Radiation underground and in the sky. Animals and birds who live nearby are dying. Oh, mercy, mercy me. Oh, things ain't what they used to be. What about this overcrowded land? How much more abuse for man can she stand? Oh, now